Olá, boa tarde a todos. Vamos dar início à conferência que encerra o dia de hoje. Vai ser a conferência do Tom Avermaete, da TH de Zurique, que vai ser apresentado pelo arquiteto Luís Urbano, professor aqui na Faculdade de Arquitectura da Universidade do Porto, e que vai falar em representação da Fundação Marques da Silva, por a Fundação Marques da Silva ser a instituição que acolhe a vinda, é a anfitriã, is the host of Tom Avermaete. Luís Urbano.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here in a dark and rainy Friday afternoon. And although I took part of the first edition of Team Ten Farwest in Guimarães 2 years ago, and I teach here in the school, today I'm here on behalf of the Marques da Silva Foundation. Together with the School of Architecture, the foundation is Porto's University Center for the Study and Dissemination of Portuguese Architecture, and I believe of great importance for the researchers gathered here around Team 10, as most, if not all, of the Portuguese architects involved in this particular and rich period of architecture history are present in our archives. So let me just make a quick reference to the names that will be extensively mentioned in these 3 days. Fernando Távora, Viana de Lima, Lígia Filgueiras, Estes Ferreira, Bartolomeu Costa Cabral, or Alfredo Matos Ferreira. So you are more than welcome to study their archives at Fundação Marques da Silva Foundation. In the next few months, you will notice that other names, some present in the room today, will be added to this extraordinary group of protagonists. But my task here is to very briefly present our distinguished guest, Tom Avermaete. Tom studied architecture in Belgium and Denmark, and his PhD was focused on the work of French contributors to the Team 10, Georges Candilis, Alexis Josic, and Shadrach Woods. As editor, he was or is part of several publications, such as OASC Journal for Architecture, the Journal of Architectural Education, the Architectural Theory Review, the Docomomo Journal, or the Bloomsbury Studies in Modern Architecture. He's also a very prolific author, either alone or in collaboration with other scholars, and recent publications include Making a New World, Reforming and Designing Modern Communities, Architecture of the Welfare State, The Balcony, together with Ram Koolhaas, Casablanca, Chandigarh, Shopping Towns, and Acculturating the Shopping Center. Some of these books were catalogues of exhibitions that Tom curated, such as In the Desert of Modernity, Casablanca and Chandigarh, that held at CCA in Canada, and Lived in the Modern City as Performative Infrastructure. Tom also played important leadership roles at the Flemish Architectural Archives, the Jap Bakama Center, or the Berlage Center for Advanced Studies in Architecture and Urban Design. With all this immense research practice, it doesn't come as a surprise that Tom Avermaete has a long teaching experience. He held several visiting or permanent professorships at Milan Polytechnic, the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, the Tokyo Institute of Technology, the University of Copenhagen, or the Delft University of Technology. And he is now full professor of History and Theory of Urban Design at the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, Switzerland. So his research focuses on the architecture of the city and the changing roles, approaches, and tools of architects and urban designers from a cross-cultural perspective. And in today's lecture, Tom proposes to understand the importance of Team 10 through its function as contact zone within the broader horizon of post-war architectural culture. So I believe we are all very curious to understand if Tom will include some of the Portuguese architects that I named in this contact zone. So David Bowie's Space Oddity was released in 1969, not a very active year for the Team 10 group, but I guess I can say ground control to Major Tom.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, thank you for this very kind and I would say also original introduction. That's the first time that I hear that introduction. First of all, of course, I wanted to thank the organizers of this conference to indeed bring me back to a research subject that I started upon in the late 1990s, because that's when my research into Candidus Josic Woods started. Within the context of this conference, which is entitled Ten Farwest, I want to address once again the question of how to look upon the modus operandi and the character of Team 10. In the past decade, Team 10 has been investigated from a variety of angles, being alternatively casted as an association, a family, a group, or even a paradigm. In this lecture, I propose to understand the importance of Team 10 in its function as a contact zone within the broader post-war architectural culture. Such a contact zone is a space where people meet with one another, but also, and maybe more importantly, a locus in which diverse ideas, concepts, and approaches encounter and grapple with one another. For architectural culture, the importance of such a contact zone resides in the fact that viewpoints and perspectives that previously belonged to different communities of practice, to various architectural cultures, or to distinct theoretical geographies are confronted and are transculturated. I will try to argue in this lecture that within the contact zone of Team 10, a threefold expansion was taking place. What I would call a thematic expansion on the one hand, an agential expansion on the other hand, and an epistemological expansion as a third sort of expansion. These expansions not only widened and complexified previous notions of architecture, for instance those that were held within the CIAM, they also had a lasting impact on architectural culture in the second half of the 20th century, I maintain. To be more precise, I will argue that these three expansions were at the basis of a new definition of architectural practice, a new definition of architectural practice which I would like to call a reflexive practice. And I will try to illustrate what I mean by this reflexive practice. A good point to start my story is by looking at the 1959 meeting that was held at Arie van der Velde Skreul and Muller Museum in Otterlo in September 1959, and which is commonly held to mark the announcement of the end of CIAM and the triumph of Team 10. A meeting of which we are celebrating the 60th birthday, I believe, in this conference. The Otterlo meeting was a well-attended gathering. Participants included, I would say, the usual suspects of Alison and Peter Smithson, Joshua Dillis and Shadrach Woods, but also Nathan Ernesto Rogers, Kenzo Tange and Louis Kahn, as well as several delegates from the far north, such as Ger Groom, Arne Korsmo and Ralph Erskine, but also from the far west, such as Fernando Tavera and Viana de Lima, to name two, here marked with the arrows on the slides. Though this meeting, the Otterlo meeting, stayed in many ways close to the pre-war CIAM meetings, it also differed in its organizational hierarchy of CIAM. That it left in some kind of way, or the traditional organizational hierarchy of CIAM in several committees and subcommittees. This was dissolved and replaced by individual exhibitions and presentations in plenary sessions, followed by discussions without the intervention of a chairman. Beyond this changed modus operandi, the discussions at Otterlo reflected also a set of new values and approaches to modern architecture and town planning that had been gradually gaining momentum among the new and younger members of CIAM since the first post-war Congress in Bridgewater in 1947. A first change that the Otterlo meeting introduced is what I would call a thematic expansion. It was especially the young CIAM member Aldo van Eyck who in his exhibition and presentation at Otterlo summarized one of these new developments very adequately. At Otterlo, van Eyck presented a diagram that consisted of two circles. For Van Eyck, these circles were a criticism of the modern avant-garde who, in his words, had been harping continually on what is different in our time, to such an extent even that it has lost touch with what is not different, what is always essentially the same, unquote. In the left circle, the Dutch architect represented three architectural traditions through three photographs. The Temple of Nike in the Acropolis of Athens, a contra construction by Van Doesburg, and finally a group of houses in the Alouef villages in the Algerian Sahara. For Van Eyck, the building tradition of the settlements in the oasis was as intelligible as the other architectural traditions that he was confronted with in his education as a European architect. Moreover, he considered this intelligibility complementary to other traditions that Western architectural thinking had brought to the fore, the classical and the modern tradition, the two other presentations in his circles. In a later version of his circles, Van Eyck would denote the different traditions respectively as immutability and rest, change and movement, and the vernacular of the heart, as you can see in the left circle. Van Eyck, commenting on the left circle, Van Eyck wrote, "I've been in love with all of these three for years, with the values divided between them. I can't separate them anymore, I simply can't. They complement each other, they belong to each other." And he added, when is architecture going to reconcile these essential qualities? That's what he's writing beneath the circle. Van Eyck's circles illustrate, in my opinion, a sort of double thematic expansion which was pursued by many contributors of Team 10. So a double thematic expansion, not only something that Van Eyck is doing, but many architects of Team 10. First, the left Otterlo circle of Van Eyck illustrates the aim to recalibrate the notion of modernity. It is an attempt to no longer conceive of modernity as opposite or antithetical to tradition. To be more precise, the left circle of Van Eyck seems to recognize the modernity of the vernacular and the classical traditions too. Second, the Otterlo circles, the two circles, they define architecture as a social spatial matter. This is not just a conception of relating architecture to programs or processes, but rather an understanding of the built environment as reciprocally related to the cultural dimensions of the social realm. That's, in my opinion, what you see when you look at these two circles. There's a sort of understanding that indeed the spatial realm and the social realm, they are related, not in terms of functions or in terms of program, but in terms of their cultural dimension. That's the bridge, as it were, between these two realms. This double thematic expansion would become characteristic, I believe, for Team 10 thinking and remains one of the interesting features of the architectural conception of the group. A second change, which became visible in Otterlo, in my opinion, is what I would call an agential expansion. And agential refers to agency, to who is the agent, who is the author of architecture. The very organizational structure of Team 10 suggests, in my opinion, a new way of looking at authorship. Indeed, when we look at the different encounters of Team 10 architects, we see different compositions of the group. Various persons who participate in different formations and who interact with other important designers and thinkers. In contrast to CIAM, who with the declaration of La Sarraz, for instance, aimed for a single line of approach and a sort of unified agency, Team 10 never pursued a univocal program or manifesto. Quite on the contrary, I would say. When we talk about Team 10, we seem to address, both in terms of actors and in terms of teams, a loose and dynamic assemblage. As Ralph Erskine reminds us, the group was an opportunity for exchanges in which various people independently came together and from which they independently benefited without having to reach a common view, unquote. Team 10 seems to have presented itself time and time again as a kind of swarm of people and ideas, and as such challenges our understanding of authorship in architectural culture, in that it refers not to a single author, nor to a well-delineated or specifically directed notion of agency. So that's what I believe that Team 10 is bringing us. This idea of an open accumulation for exchange and an open assemblage of authors continued in the after days of Team 10. For instance, when in the context of ILAUD, the International Laboratory of Architecture and Urban Design, in which the group of contributors of Team 10 was once again expanded and re-articulated. What was typical at these ILAUD meetings is indeed that you had people like Peter and Alison Smithson, Giancarlo De Carlo, of course, being there, but this group was expanded once more with new names like Christian Norberg Schulz, names like Bruno Zevi, names like Charles Moore or Spiro Kostov, all becoming part of this, let's say, re-articulated group of Team 10. This multiple and non-directional conception of authorship also poses a set of methodological challenges. In other words, how do we approach an assemblage of people and ideas in our investigations? How do we conceive of authorship that is multiple and non-directional? These are questions that I think we should pose ourselves when we look at Team 10. A third aspect or a third change that became visible at CIAM Otterlo can be qualified as an epistemological expansion. This epistemological expansion was already there prior to the CIAM in Otterlo, and it can be well illustrated by looking at the grids, at the grid that CIAM Alger exhibited at the CIAM meeting in 1953 in Aix-en-Provence. This grid illustrates convincingly how for many Team 10 architects, the built environment was increasingly conceived as the frame, the substance, and the outcome of spatial practices. Through methods that were inspired by anthropology, the CIAM Alger architects moved the idea of architecture as primarily concerned with composition, form, and function towards a conception in which spatial practices of living and building were at the center. A second epistemological widening, which is in my opinion part of Team 10 thinking, can also be read in this presentation by the CIAM Porto group at the occasion of the 1956 meeting in Dubrovnik. This second epistemological widening consists of their understanding of architecture as what I would like to call a reflexive practice. Indeed, in the presentation of the CIAM Porto group, ample attention is paid to the reflection that their project can make to the wider cultural question of the relation between man and his environment. In the fourth panel of the CIAM Porto presentation, the architects present their projects as, and I'm quoting them, a lesson of less developed societies, which still understands that life should be organized around the dwelling, on the one hand, le foyer, as the human base for the life of the family, and the square as the center of encounter of life in society. The new architectural project is, in other words, understood as a reflection or a critique of a contemporary way of urbanization and urban design. So that's what I would like to start calling this reflexive dimension. This reflexive conception of architecture implied that architecture was not only considered or solely considered as a problem-solving matter, which was maybe the vision of some CIAM architects previously, but rather was explicitly and intentionally understood as a discipline that reflected upon the conditions in which it operated. So architecture moving it from a problem-solving matter to a matter that is about reflecting upon the conditions in which you operate. That's for me this reflexive term. In other words, within the context of Team 10, architecture seems to be understood as a practice that has the capacity to take an inquisitive position vis-à-vis its own history, as well as vis-à-vis pressing social and cultural matters. In addition, this notion of reflexivity also refers to the idea that architecture is always a reflection, tacit or explicit, between different actors, both at the moment of design and at the moment of appropriation. Such a conception of architecture, such a reflexive conception of architecture, can be traced throughout the various projects and utterances of Team 10 architects. For instance, in this Team 10 primer, if I'm reading this Team 10 primer, I'm constantly seeing this sort of reflexive attitude, let's say, of these architects. But I want to argue in this lecture or in this talk of tonight that it became particularly visible in the many exhibitions that Team 10 architects developed, the Team 10 contributors developed. To be more precise, my hypothesis for today is that the different exhibitions explored what the reflexivity of architectural practice could entail. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that we're going to look at exhibitions of Team 10, and that these exhibitions are attempts to define what the reflexive quality, the reflexive capacities of architecture might entail. So exhibitions as exploring the reflexive capacities of architecture. The existence of Team 10 is, as many of you will know, strongly intertwined with exhibitions and with the modus operandi of curating. The initial moments of Team 10, the CIAM 1953 in Aix-en-Provence, started with indeed the exhibition of these extraordinary grids, the grids of the Gamma group, or the grids of the CIAM Alger group, or the grids, of course, by the urban re-identification groups, grids by the Smithsons. To the from these early exhibitions in the 1953 CIAM meeting to the exhibitions in the 1956 meeting in Dubrovnik, to indeed the crucial meeting in Otterlo, in 1959, the cause of Team 10 seems to have been connected to the very act of exhibiting, I would like to suggest. To say it differently, for Team 10, the exhibition was not only the ideal modus operandi to explore the discursive capacity of architecture, but also to explore the thematic and agential expansion that I was talking about before. Hence, it should come as no surprise that the very way of exhibiting, the mode of exhibiting, was strongly discussed and questioned within Team 10 circles. The Portuguese CIAM group, for instance, discussed intensively how the CIAM grid, as a main organizing tool for exhibitions, would need to be reformed. Viana de Lima intervened at many discussions, for instance at Sigtuna, and sent multiple letters to the central CIAM organization to ask for a revision of this exhibition format. At the occasion of the 1955 CIRPAC meeting of Las Saras, the CIAM group summarized their argument in a report with the different proposals for another exhibition format, and as we can see in this document. The introduction of categories such activité and pensée, activities and thinking, at the occasion of the Sigtuna meeting, for instance, was one of the alterations, one of the modifications that they suggested. As well as the introduction of the manière de vivre, a manifestation of individual and collective, another suggestion for the modification of the grid that they suggested in Aix-en-Provence in 1953. Or the introduction of the category of milieu, which they indeed suggested up to the 1955 meeting in Paris, are all, in my opinion, expansions or suggestions to expand this exhibition format, but also suggestions for domains in which architecture might be understood as a reflexive practice. Team 10 contributors looked upon exhibitions as platforms for discursive exchange, but especially as laboratory settings in which new conceptual stances could be articulated. As Allison and Peter Smithson claimed, the exhibition material becoming itself the means of spatial organization. Many of the Team 10 architects looked upon exhibitions as a modus operandi that allowed for temporary assemblages of new conceptual and experiential realities. Some of them, like Giancarlo De Carlo, maintained that the temporary character of the exhibition was an asset. because while being architecture, it allowed for a constant reformulation of ideas. So that's the way that Giancarlo De Carlo was looking upon it. The exhibition allows us to make architecture, but it also allows us to very, very quickly change things, modify things, and thus change ideas. De Carlo was writing, exhibitions are like houses of cards. They need very little to make them collapse. And he looked upon that as a quality. A first exhibition instance that I would like to take you to is this 9th Milan Triennale held in 1951, a collective exhibition in which various architects that were to be related to Team 10 participated. A first example of what this reflexivity in architectural practice might entail was, in my opinion, offered by Nathan Ernesto Rogers and Vittorio Gregotti at the occasion of their installation, The Measure of Man, at the 1951 Milano Triennale. The contribution of Rogers and Gregotti was entitled The Measure of Man, and it used a collage-like scenography of photographs to create a statement upon how to look upon the relation between architecture and human actors beyond the Taylorist understanding of functionalism. Just a few examples of this installation by Rogers and Gregotti. Rogers and Gregotti combined such a diverse images as the photographic recording of movement of a golf player by photographer Muybridge with the modernist architectural figure of the Promenade Architecturale at the Villa Savoie and a fragment of an historical Italian town, which was in his turn combined with a sketch of the Barcelona pavilion of Mies and a fragment of a Baroque decoration. Rogers himself conceived of his exhibition as a statement about the fact that the measure of man reached much further than sheer ergonomics. He looked up in a short text with their exhibition. Rogers and Gregotti also maintained that the lens of the measure of man allowed architects, modern architects, to think different time periods, to think through different time periods and to reconcile the historical and the modern. So that's what they claimed with the little text that they wrote with this exhibition, that this was an attempt to establish new links, let's say, between history and the modern, and that's what they also tried to visualize in this collage-like exhibition. In the exhibition of Rogers and Gregotti, the reflexivity of architecture is conceived as a dialogue between contemporary architectural practice and the various instances that compose the history of architecture. It is clear that for Rogers and Gregotti, the reflexivity of architecture resides in its capacity to reflect upon its own history. Their exhibition suggests that architecture in general, and modern architecture specifically, maintains a reflexive relation with instances that are far away and nearby in its own history. In other words, the reflexivity of architecture is defined as the capacity to construct, articulate and maintain a relation between the present and the past of architecture, between the contemporary and the historical. At the same 1951 Triennale, Milano Triennale, also Giancarlo De Carlo, another affiliate of Team 10, presented an important contribution and thereby indirectly reflected upon the reflexivity of architectural practice. More than a decade before Bernard Trudowski's well-known 1964 exhibition on architecture without architects, De Carlo proposed an exhibition with the title Arquitectura Spontanea and claimed that it was time for architecture to expand its knowledge field to those parts of the built environment that were not designed by professionals, but emerged, as it were, spontaneously. Just to give you a few examples. De Carlo focused on spontaneous built structures in rural areas, as you saw in these images, but also claimed that within cities, large parts of the built environment could be qualified as vernacular because they emerged without the intervention of the professional. De Carlo argued that vernacular architecture not only offered a broad repertory of forms and creative expressions, but that it also illustrated a different relationship between man and the built environment, a relationship of interest and care. The exhibition of De Carlo can be looked upon as a reflection upon the way that contemporary architecture can be reflexive vis-à-vis vernacular architecture or spontaneous architecture. The exhibition not only celebrated the ingenuity of spontaneous vernacular architecture, it also confronted this with new projects that reflected upon this spontaneous tradition. So if you look, for instance, to the image at the right, the images are not that clear maybe, but it's the best that I could find. You can see that he's combining an understanding of the vernacular with a proposal for new housing projects, which you see to the complete right there. And what I'm suggesting to you is that in this tension between studying the vernacular and proposing modern projects, a sort of exploration is made of what this reflexivity of architecture can be. Architecture can reflect upon the vernacular by combining a study of vernacular ways of building and vernacular materialities with new typologies. In this field of tension, a certain reflexivity is emerging. That's what I'm proposing to you. The exhibition of De Carlo illustrates that by confronting vernacular materials and building techniques with modern housing typologies, architecture can maintain a reflexive relation with the vernacular. The contributions of Rogers, Gregotti, and De Carlo at the 1951 Milano Triennale foreshadowed, I think, how Team 10 architects would deal with exhibitions, always looking upon exhibitions as laboratory situations in which different conceptions could be explored. A second, exhibition that I want to present to you is the exhibition, that was made at the occasion of the 1953 CIAM meeting in Aix-en-Provence, where in my idea, this question of the reflexivity of architectural practice was once again put on the agenda, this time not only to include the historical and the vernacular, as we saw in the Milan Triennale, but also the informal and the ordinary. Particularly two groups who came from North Africa caused a lot of upheaval at this 9th CIAM meeting. The CIAM Alger group, of which you see some images here, and the Gamma group of architects working in Morocco. They loosely used the CIAM exhibition format of the grid, but developed it in such a way that it became a critical tool that spoke about the relation of architecture to ordinary environments, the ordinary environments of the shanty towns at the edge of cities. Future Team 10 contributors like Candilis Woods, but also Miguel, who worked on this grid, exhibited a new way of thinking in which the most ordinary of environments could offer a reflexive horizon for modern architecture. So what I'm suggesting here is that indeed these grids were an attempt to show or to conceptualize these most ordinary environments, these shanty towns, these bidonvilles, as an horizon, a reflexive horizon for modern architecture. Just a few images. Looking upon various aspects, by the way, of these most ordinary environments, looking at their material qualities, looking at their social qualities, looking at their symbolic qualities, and so on. This was true for the CIAM Alger grid, but it was also certainly true for the Gamma grid, where again, for instance, this look upon these most ordinary environments and understanding their symbolic meaning, their material logics, their build logics was really at the center of attention and was presented, and that's what I want to get across, as a reflexive horizon for modern architecture. I think that that's really the turn which is made there. This turn wouldn't remain limited to the exhibition at the occasion of the CIAM 1953, the CIAM 9 1953 in Aix-en-Provence, but I believe that afterwards, other architects, for instance the Smithsons, they continue to work with that team in exhibitions, particularly in this exhibition, This Is Tomorrow exhibition, of course, in which they indeed made their installation, Patio and Pavilion, a few years, 3 years after the CIAM 9 design exhibition, and in my mind, again, offered these most ordinary environments of the shed and the shanty town, let's say, as a reflexive horizon for modern architecture. A third instance of exhibiting into which I would like to take you, and in which this reflexive capacity of architecture was explored by Team 10 affiliates, was the 1968 Triennale of Milano, curated by Giancarlo De Carlo. In this Triennale, with the title The Greatest Number, several of the Team 10 contributors, including Alison and Peter Smithson, Aldo van Eyck and Shadrach Woods, together with Pfeiffer, questioned the capacity of architecture to react to the massive processes of modernization. In various ways, the Team 10 architects explored the potential of architecture to reflect upon these modernization processes. And they were not alone. There were other architects like Arata Isozaki, Archigram, and George Nelson, who were also part of this exhibiting venture. 30 May 1968 saw the opening of the 14th Milan Triennale. However, it was immediately occupied by a group of artists and students. On June 8, an eviction was organized, followed by the resignation of De Carlo along with the entire executive committee. The exhibition, however, became well known through photos of the exhibits and the occupation, its catalogue, newspaper articles, and the manifestos that were issued. It reopened also officially on the 23rd of June and was protected at that moment by the police. The exhibition consisted of several installations and opened with an installation by Giancarlo De Carlo with the title The Protest of the Young People. In this exhibition, De Carlo illustrated how indeed the ongoing processes of modernization, here symbolized by remnants of washing machines and televisions in front of the image, were becoming the focus of a wider international critique and protests. But the exhibition also connected these modernization processes to the built environment. De Carlo's installation featured large heaps of cobblestones, suggesting that the streets and spaces of the city were the expression of an old societal organization. Just as the students had claimed in the streets of Paris and Prague, sous le pavé la plage, the built environment had to be literally overturned to reach a new way of organizing society. The installation of Aldo van Eyck, entitled Mourn also for All Butterflies, was an exploration of how architecture could be reflective concerning the effects of modernization. His contribution was a critique of the relation between the modernized environment and man. Van Eyck, you will see, had a somber understanding of the effects of modernization and confronted his visitors with a sort of dystopian image of a geography of hypermodernization. Visitors were in the first part presented with a dense labyrinth of black tree trunks, as you see here. This first disorienting experience was fortified in a second part of the exhibition that was cladded with broken mirrors and confronted the visitor with his broken self-image. Van Eyck's take on modernization was somber, and in the last part of the installation, he added a bit of color, but also introduced somber slogans, as we have to mourn the butterflies, in some kind of way also saying that modernization was harsh, you could say, even on actors that were non-human, like the butterflies. At least that's how I'm understanding this. Alison and Peter Smithson offered another take on the reflexive relation between modernization and the built environment. In their installation, entitled Wedding in the City, they explored how architecture could reflect upon a more green and ecological pattern of modernization. In a combination of models, a spatial collage, and drawings, their exhibition literally deconstructed the various layers of the city, built and green, modern and traditional. In the middle of the space, we, for instance, perceive a double model, partially attached to the floor and partially attached to the ceiling. which speaks about the question of how to marry the green open city with the dense urban tissue of the historical city. The Smithsons ask how they could be recombined, wedded in their opinion, in a more sustainable way. For the Smithsons, the reflexive capacity of architecture entailed the ability to propose new patterns of urbanization, starting from some of the existing components, as we can see here. In other words, the reflexivity of architecture resided in its capacity to propose new spatial patterns, which were dense and green, traditional and modern, simultaneously. One of the most interesting installations was no doubt the pavilion by Shadrach Woods and Pfeiffer, officially entitled The Transformation of Urban Structure Through the New Conceptions of the Habitat and of the Greatest Number. A very long title for an installation, we can say. This two-level open structure brought in a collage of photographs, diagrams, plans, and text, and let's say in that sense, questioned and criticized and reflected upon the unbridled character of modernization. The reflexivity of architecture was here clearly understood as a matter of intervening in important contemporary processes of modernization. Here we see some of the installation. So the reflexivity of architecture was understood as intervening in and reflecting upon important contemporary processes of modernization, processes such as anonymity and mobility. These are some panels of the pavilion, or the uncontrolled patterns of urbanization. The exhibition of Woods was a moral appeal to the visitors of the Triennale to become more engaged in these urban issues, to reflect upon these urban issues, we could say. The accompanying publication was entitled Urbanism is Everybody's Business. This is the accompanying publication to the exhibition. Just as the exhibition, it made readers aware of the fact that the modernization of the built environment was not an occurrence outside of themselves, but rather a reflexive process in which citizens were active players and in which they could take a stance. Some of the panels in the pavilion asked the question, who creates and for whom? Qui crée et pour qui? It is clear that in the installation of Woods, the reflexivity of architectural practice is not an exclusive matter of the architect as a single agent, but rather a concern of multiple actors, not at least the inhabitants and the users of the city. At one instance of his installation, Woods confronted his visitors with a playboard or with a table, as you can see there, suggesting that it was their turn to discuss and to act consciously in the built environment. The text on the table reads, a table on which one can discuss about urban design or other things. The reflexivity of architecture is clearly conceived as a dialogue between different actors, not only architects, but also other citizens were considered as full-fledged voices in the ongoing modernization. As a banner that was added to the pavilion, most probably by the students, mentioned, in the view of Woods, all voices had to be heard in this reflexive process. Il est interdit d'interdire. In the exhibitions for the 1968 Milano Triennale by Van Eyck, the Smithsons and Woods, the reflexivity of architecture is defined as its capacity to intervene in larger social and cultural processes and realities. The spatial characteristics of architecture are on the one hand firmly related to the broader social, political and cultural processes, but this also endows architecture with the power to reflect upon these broader political, social, and cultural developments they maintain. So what I'm trying to say is what you see typically in these installations of the 1968 Milan Triennale is that architecture is made part of the bigger processes of modernization, but it is also giving the agency to react, to reflect, to criticize these processes of modernization. That's the bridge, in my opinion, which is constructed in these pavilions like the pavilion of, or in these installations like the installation of Shadrach Woods. In other words, by making statements in the formal, spatial, and aesthetic realm, architecture can reflect upon the heteronymous matters of economy, social life, and politics. The last example of an exhibition in which the 10 architects participated that I want to mention today is a true life exhibition, I would say. The Previ Lima experimental housing competition and project, which resulted in a model town or a model neighborhood, which in my mind is also an exhibition. Launched in 1969, this competition called for the design of low-rise and high-density urban housing organized in clusters and with the provision of the possibility of adaptation and enlargement. Previ Lima became an important moment in the architectural culture of the late 1960s because it allowed for a reflection on the idea of the house as a process in addition to its value as object. Within the vision of the United Nations, the commissioner of the competition, each scheme was to anticipate the process of occupancy, but also the process of transformation. The competition involved in the end 13 international and 13 local architects, and finally led to the construction of a model neighborhood comprising of fragments designed by different architects, like a patchwork. Several Team 10 contributors, including Aldo van Eyck, Candinus and Woods, but also Oscar Hansen, would contribute to this model exhibition and would, in my mind, use the occasion to reflect one more time upon the reflexivity of architecture. Instigated by the specific attention for the development of the dwelling by future inhabitants in the brief, the projects by Team 10 contributors would become an investigation on how architecture can be reflective vis-à-vis the practices of construction and transformation by inhabitants. So the question in my mind became, how can architecture be reflexive vis-à-vis the practices of future users of inhabitants? And here you see some of the entries. The first one is Candidus Josic Wood, the second one Aldo van Eyck, and the last one Oscar Hansen and Sven Hatloy. The project of Candidus Josic Woods understood the reflexivity of architecture and future interventions by tenants as a matter of providing the possibility of various spatial combinations. Their proposal was a design in strips, as you can see, in which rooms could be combined in relation to changing dwelling needs and aspirations. It is clear that the reflexivity in the case of Candidus Josic Woods is conceived as a matter of offering spatial combinations, spatial configurations. Time and time again, the architecture will reflect the changing patterns of dwelling. The proposal of Aldo van Eyck offered a completely different viewpoint. In the case of the Dutch architect, it was the combination of climatological and self-built concerns that sets the stage for reflexivity. Van Eyck proposed hexagonal plots on which inhabitants could at least partially fashion their own dwelling. The architectural frame that Van Eyck set for this approach was determined by the necessity for cross-ventilation in the core of the house. This is suggested by these red arrows, requiring an empty space in the middle of the plot. But also by the form of the perimeter wall around the plot, the perimeter around the plots, of which a specific height and form accommodated or prevented certain vertical extensions. In other words, in the perimeter walls of Van Eyck, the height and shape of the wall regulates the reflexivity between the originally designed wall and the transformations that the tenants themselves will add. In the project by Oscar Hansen and Sven Hatloy, the materiality of architecture would become the main element of reflexivity. The project of Hansen and Hatloy is designed as in two material stages. A first stage consists of a primary structure, building the prefabricated concrete elements with a heavy crane. This first stage determines the longue durée of the project. The second stage is carried out by the tenants themselves by using lighter elements of clay and concrete blocks, lintels, wall panels, partitions, windows, woven fibrous screens and textiles, all capable of assembling in a number of combinations to suit the occupant's needs. The materiality of architecture, in its heavy or lightweight character, became the realm of reflexivity between the agency of the architect and the agency of the inhabitants. In the Previlima model exhibition, architects like Van Eyck and Candilis Jossic Woods and Oscar Hansen explored how the reflexivity of architecture could be understood as part of its capacity through its very material and formal qualities to reflect upon the relation between designer and user. So what I'm trying to say here is that, let's say, the formal and material qualities of architecture, they mediate, as it were, between the agency of the designer on the one hand and the agency of the user on the other hand, and they reflect upon this relation in my mind as well. There's this reflexivity in my opinion. In the various projects that the Team 10 architects proposed, form and materiality function as a realm in which the relation between the agency of the architect and the agency of the user can be reflected and can be reflected upon. The design proposals, each in their own way, seem to suggest a particular conception of this relation and of the role that architecture can play in reflecting this relation. This brings me to my conclusion. At the end of this talk, I want to return one more time to the exhibitions of the Team 10 architects, which almost without exception were no solo exhibitions, but collective ventures. The Milano Triennale of 1951 was an encounter between the well-established Nathan Ernesto Rogers and the young Giancarlo De Carlo. The CIAM 9 meeting was a clash between young architects working in the global south, in North Africa for instance, and those working in the global north. The exhibitions in the Milano Triennale confronted the North American experiences of Shad Woods to the left with the European perspectives of the Smithsons to the right. In all of these instances, the exhibition functioned as a contact zone between different cultural and intellectual actors and geographies. The exhibitions of Team 10 illustrate that there is a need, I would say, to think in a more complex way about how assemblages of architects, such as Team 10, functioned. An interesting concept is offered by Marie-Louise Pratt, a literary scholar who introduced in the 1990s the notion of contact zone in her seminal article, Arts of the Contact Zone. In this article, Pratt spoke of a contact zone as a matter of difference and conflicts, as a matter of spaces where different cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in highly asymmetrical relations of domination and subordination. Important for us also is that Pratt defines the contact zone as places of what she calls transculturation, a process that was identified as a transition that is combining notions of acculturation with notions of deculturation and is geared to coming up with a new cultural phenomenon. My proposal for today would be to look upon Team 10 as such a contact zone. This transculturation between different professional cultures, theoretical and practical cultures, is in my opinion the ultimate form of reflexivity. If Team 10 illustrated one important thing, then it is certainly that the field of architecture has this capacity to be reflexive across different cultures. This the transculturation allowed Team 10 to conceive of architecture as what I would call a reflexive practice. Throughout the various exhibitions of Team 10, modern architecture emerged as a practice that can be reflexive towards its own history, towards the vernacular and the ordinary ways of building, towards larger social, political, and cultural developments, as well as to different agencies in the built environment. This idea of architecture as a reflexive practice would not only gain currency in Team 10 circles, but would, in my opinion, influence the wider architectural culture of the post-war period and represent the continuous topicality of Team 10 until today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. If someone has a question or a comment.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. It was, fantastic. And also great to see that you also brought some Portuguese examples to this, which is also very good to see how, Portugal is also part, or at least some Portuguese architects were also part of this contact zone. But I want to ask you something about your proposal of how in these CIAM and Team 10 meetings you could see emerging really, this idea of the reflexivity of the architectural practice that could just then generate projects like the ones that we saw eventually in Lima at the turn of the 70s. But at the same time, we also had, the Robin Hood Gardens, or we had Toulouse-les-Mirails, or, of course, also the orphanage of Aldo van Eyck. And so my question is, to what extent do you think that, that process was the Previ Lima that you described as almost a kind of a natural product of that reflexivity?
Yeah.
But then we also saw projects by the same protagonists that apparently were not going the same line. So this is one question. And maybe as a follow-up, do you think that when Team 10 ends also this possibility of having the architectural practice as a milieu for to reflect on issues also ended and we then started a crisis or something like that?
Well, that's a big question, of course, and I think you immediately go to, in some kind of way, you could say the core of my argument, and maybe also the weakness of my argument, I must say as well. What I try to show to you is, of course, not to say that Team 10 as an assemblage of people, because that's, I think, what they were, was the only instance of this reflexive practice, let's say. I think that this was a much wider development. But what I do feel is that within Team 10, let's say, one of the reasons for people engaging in Team 10 and relentlessly or repeatedly engaging in Team 10 was because of this capacity to be part of such a reflexive and the intensity of a reflexive practice. At least that's how I'm looking upon Team 10 right now, because sometimes you ask yourself what was the interest, let's say, to come to these Team 10 meetings. So, and I think that for me that's let's say looking nowadays back upon Team 10 and knowing what we know of Team 10, I think that this was one of the main drivers, that people could profit, as it were, from this reflexivity, which was not a reflexivity of a single office or of a single person, but which was indeed a more collective reflexivity, let's say. And that's why I was also interested in the exhibitions, because of course these exhibitions, they have a certain degree of freedom. They're not connected to a particular program or hardly connected to a particular program besides the Previ Lima. So I think there this reflexivity, let's say, went full blast, as it were, really was developed with very, very high intensity. And my inclination is that people really felt that this was important, let's say. For me, also looking back upon architectural culture after, let's say, Team 10, let's say of the 1970s and 80s, I think that these points of intense reflexivity, collective reflexivity, that they are scarce, I must say. So I think in that sense, I understand why Team 10 affiliates, let's say, cherished Team 10 and cherished this collective reflexivity, because I think as we go in the 1980s and in the 1990s, that there are very, very little moments or very little platforms or whatever we want to call them where this reflexivity can thrive. And I think in that sense, it's good that that's why I said I think that it's still topical today, because in my mind, architectural culture is not made by singular persons, let's say, or not only made by singular persons. That's of course what all of our architectural histories are telling us. Architectural culture is propelled by singular agents, grand masters or grand mistresses. We're trying to tell right now. But what I'm trying to suggest to you, and I think that's why why Team 10 is still so interesting, is because it's indeed about a collective reflexivity, let's say. And collective reflexivity doesn't mean a dogma, doesn't mean a unified voice. I said that in the beginning, but it's a collective reflexivity of confrontation, of negotiation, of dispute, and so on. I think in these kind of processes, this reflexivity is thriving, and people are learning a lot, let's say. And that's, I think, why people came to Team 10. I mean, I would say. But you're right, of course, that there are other moments. Now, to go back to the first part of your question, you're right, of course, that there are other moments where people were back home, let's say, not part of these Team 10 meetings, and designing, and where there's maybe another sort of reflexivity emerging. So I'm not saying that Team 10 is the only moment of this collective reflexivity. We know, for instance, from the people working in London, that in London there were also these smaller groups where exchange was going on, and where people were meeting at Sunday afternoon in the house of the Smithsons or in the house of Alan Colquhoun and so on, and discussing things as well. So I'm not saying that this was the only platform, but I think it was a very important platform of this collective reflexivity.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for bringing this marvelous set of images. So I'm curious about this exhibition practice that you're emphasizing here, because in fact, there is no such thing as a collective Team 10 exhibition, right? They're all functioning individually or as part, together as partners, but there's no Team 10 collective. I mean, the meetings really are collective contexts, but they're sort of closed contexts. You're either invited or you're not, right? And then the exhibitions are sort of authorial occasions where each group is sort of producing its own thing. Maybe there is a certain kind of debate that is produced just, naturally, collectively, but it's not a group. Unlike the independent group, right?
Yes.
Or even some CIAM exhibitions, or even in the very early period, Dada, you think about those kinds of occasions. So I'm not so sure that they're not functioning as authors, if the subject matter is coming from vernacular or low rather than high culture. So
well, I think it's a very, this is of course a very nuanced story, and I'm happy that you remind me of these other examples as well. I think maybe going back for a moment to my notion of the contact zone, to get that into the discussion as well. What is very interesting about this notion of a contact zone is that it's suggesting that in the contact zone you're not necessarily completely acculturating. Normally, when I'm looking upon, let's say, exhibitions which are group exhibitions, like let's say the group exhibition of the independent group, there's a sort of acculturation to the general frame. Let's say that's part of the venture. Try to remember the first CIAM exhibition, when was it, 28, 29, when they imagined to do this, and there was an idea of streamlining all of the examples and exhibiting that and having that travel, let's say, as well. So for me, when I'm looking upon Team 10, and this is what I'm proposing as a hypothesis here right now, I think it needs a function as a contact zone. And what does that mean? In a contact zone, as Marie-Louise Pratt is saying, you have simultaneously processes of acculturation and deculturation, meaning you take some things of the others, but you also push some things of the others away, and that means that you need to maintain a certain authorship, let's say as well. We know architects, they're not so easily going to give up their own authorship, let's say as well. So they enter with an idea of authorship, but this authorship is understood in relation to other authorships, I would say, and some things are maybe, so that's the way that I'm, for instance, looking upon the Milan Triennale of 1968. I'm understanding that as an attempt to, there is a general theme. We take position vis-à-vis that general theme. We also know a bit what the others are going to do, but we're of course not confirming to a bigger theme. So it's this complex assemblage. And as you were rightly saying, what is also very, very interesting to think about is that indeed it's never about the core group or the core family, but that there are always other actors there as well, which only belong peripherally to Team 10 or are occasionally invited guests, which was very typical for Team 10 as well. I mean, it was never a boxed group, though some of us have tried to say, okay, this is the core family, let's say. It was always this loose assemblage, this loose contact zone, in my terms, of actors. I don't know if I responded to your question completely, John. I don't think so.
But there is, I mean, the core, the Smiths and there is a core, and then there is a change in cast of others that get invited in. And they worry about, you know, keeping small.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yeah. Well,
thank you, Tom. I was thinking, as we are here in an architectural school, if these architects around Team 10, they also try to, we could also see this reflective practice that I think it's a very stimulating idea on their educational practice as educators.
Yeah.
For instance, I remember that Fernando Távora in 1970, after some discussions and debates here in the school, he said we need theoreticians, not practitioners. So he was also claiming for this theoretical approach to architecture.
Yes.
Do you see this? We could also see this approach in the educators around Giancarlo, Van Eyck.
Yeah. Well, what I'm slowly developing in my mind, and also together with some of my colleagues in Zurich, because we are discussing these things in our group as well, is that of course it would be interesting to start thinking about architectural culture as a set of these contact zones, let's say. So exhibitions can be one particular contact zone where people, with all of the remarks that John Ockman made, I think rightly, with all of the remarks that you can make about it, but certainly also teaching situations can be contact zones as well. When Marie-Louise Prat is talking about the contact zone, she's talking about the classroom. That's her first contact zone. And for instance, one of the things that I'm thinking about is also to look at ILOUT, for instance, which were indeed courses, which were presented as classrooms, let's say, as one of these important contact zones as well. And there again, we see this core group of Team 10 emerging with a whole set of new people. Suddenly Bernardo Secchi is there, and suddenly Spiro Kostov is there as well. So I think that's for me the interest. So my answer to you is yes, there are multiple contact zones. I think that even certain, one of my colleagues in Zurich is working on the question that even certain competitions, they can be looked upon as contact zones as well. When several people, larger competitions, when several people make a stance vis-à-vis a joint team, that this can be looked upon a contact zone as well. So this is an attempt to understand architectural culture and the development of architectural culture in a different way, and not putting so much stress on singular figures, but understand that these singular figures, they function in indeed bigger zones, if you want to, which can be very different in character, as it were. So that's, I'm also looking upon Team 10 as one of these very important zones, which indeed can develop this idea of reflexive practice. I think, well, with all of the side marks that we can make with that idea as well.
I have a question. I think the identity of Team 10 is very based on an editorial basis, more than these collective exhibitions. It's more building a book or editing a book, like Alison Smithson, I think, is the main actress that wants to do that. What do you think about that possibility of this reflexive practice through edition of books, as Alison, I think, would lead?
Well, of course, as we all know, I mean, this was, of course, a very important part of Team 10. I mean, indeed, this practice of, I would say, editing, publishing, combining things in a particular way. I think in that sense, it's interesting, for instance, to think about the format of the Team 10 primer as a different sort of publication, where I'm literally talking about the format of how bringing different stances even normally, of course, what is the big disadvantage of making a publication? That is compared with an exhibition, that is that a publication is linear, let's say. You read it from page 1 to page 2, well, you can browse through it as well, but there is never the same sort of coexistence as in an exhibition. In an exhibition, you can have different things coexist in the same space. In a publication, you always have the sequence, as it were, of the publication. I think that part of Alison Smithson's search in the Team 10 primer is to create a similar sort of coexistence, let's say. And for me, this coexistence fits with this, again, with this idea of the contact zone. It's not about a singular viewpoint, it's about several viewpoints being present simultaneously, about several viewpoints coexisting. And I think that that's what she was after in this very difficult and actually not that good format, maybe, of the simple book, of the simple publication, let's say. So I think that that's, for me, important. So I do think that, of course, in what Alison is doing, part of this reflexive practice is embedded as well. I also think in many of their projects, this is embedded as well, or their proposals. For instance, if you ask me, the Free University of Berlin, not of Candilis Josic Woods, is certainly also part of this reflexive practice, let's say, trying to understand the relation between this agency of the architect and the agency of the user, let's say, and understanding the materiality of architecture as the in-between, as the reflexive matter, I would say. So, just to come back to your question, yes, of course, also the publications are part of this reflexive matter, and in the search of Alison, we see that. I mean, we see that she's struggling, I would say, with that. It's a bit of a remarkable format that she's coming up with now in this Team 10 primer, with these columns and big and small text, images and quotes, all mixed, in order to, well, to create this contact zone, or to let's say, I would say, illuminate this contact zone. That would be my suggestion.
Can I ask one more?
Yes.
So the contact zone seems to be very valuable concept here, because it really suggests a space of encounter, of coming together. This idea of reflexivity, I wonder about. I'm wondering whether something like dialogical wouldn't be a better way. Reflexivity, at least to me, implies a certain kind of bouncing back on yourself. It also implies kind of critical reflection, and I'm just curious what you think about. I mean, another thing that seems to be happening in all these spaces or contact zones that you're identifying is a sort of deinstitutionalization in the sense of a vertical organization of groups and forms. So there's a more horizontal distribution of people, of powers, and so forth. And the idea of dialogue or conversation, which Alison seems very intent on in organizing Team 10 primer. Also thinking about Ernesto Rogers, who talks a lot about polyvocality already, and Team 10 likes to make it seem like they're making a huge break from everything that went before, but there is more continuity
of course.
than one would think. So this kind of a dialogic, almost like a Bakhtinian model of polyvocality or chorality might be more persuasive for me than reflexivity as a framing.
Thanks for the remarks. I think you're making very interesting remarks also about indeed these hierarchies in the contact zone as well. That's a very, I think, fundamental remark. And again, brings us maybe back to the absence of a master narrative in the Team 10 primer as well, by the way. Also trying to confuse, let's say, that hierarchy as well. Yeah, this idea of reflexivity, I could say much more about it. I'm of course getting that from Ulrich Beck and the idea of a reflexive modernity. That's what inspired me. I couldn't elaborate on that right now, but I have of course thought a bit more about that. And the thing that Beck is saying is that the modernity is indeed a modernity that constantly evolves. So it's not creating I mean, at least that's what I'm taking from it. It's not creating a sort of tradition that is there and a modernity that it's here, but it's a constant back and forth between what is happening and the idea of a modernity. So I'm interested also in this bouncing back, because I think that much of the work of Team 10 is that the projects, they are speaking about the situation in which they are, let's say, supposed to intervene. So when I'm looking upon, what should I say? I mean, much of the projects also of Candelas and Woods, they are, in my opinion, proposals for a certain reality, and I think they also reflect back upon these. So there is something reflexive in that. But I agree, maybe when looking at the group dynamics of Team 10, that then this more choral conception of what is happening there might be maybe more adequate. What I try to do right now, but I don't know if that came very well across, is that I said that the group dynamics of Team 10 I would like to describe as this contact zone. And the actual, let's say, if you want to design practice of Team 10 or curatorial practice of Team 10, I would like to describe as reflexive. That was the sort of. But I, of course, see what you're saying as well. It's a proposal to understand this functioning of Team 10 in a different way and to find, let's say, the adequate concepts to do that, which is an ongoing search, obviously as well.
Mais alguma questão? Well, if not, thank you, Tom. Tomorrow we will have a big and long day. We will start at 9:30. We will end with the final debate shared by Nelson Mota, with Tom, with Joan, and with Łukasz, and we will have the conference of Łukasz Stanek also tomorrow. After the 3 sessions, the session of Habitat first, then networks, and then media. So it's a long day. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.